Yes.
Hello, Krunk.
Hello.
Yes, I'm wanted to connect with you because Kalas told me that I have an incarnation in your species.
Correct. Many of you do.
Okay,
Here I am. There you
all
are.
right. Well, if that's the case, then I'd like to learn more about you and perhaps bring more of this incarnation into my human life.
First and
What kind
foremost,
of
aware that every lifetime comes from what you're considering an oversoul is a reflection of each other on some level. However, there are different aspects that are there for a reason. So, if you have one aspect of yourself that is one thing rather than another, there's no point in trying to equalize one with the other because having this one incarnation is a reflection of a certain aspect of the oversoul, which then no longer needs to be expressed in another form. The other form also existing for a reason to express a different frequency of the same oversoul. Yes,
okay? Well,
doesn't mean that there can't be an overlay of frequency, but nonetheless, I don't see the point in trying to be another reflection of the same concept rather than the one that's already being acted out in another form.
well, for me, it's just creating a different experience. And there's some other things going on in my life, and I feel like incorporating a new frequency for another species will be beneficial.
There's nothing wrong with interacting and learning, yes. Also, your species is very confused. You have an overabundance of emotion and very little to do with it. So having some more structure would highly help in most of you. Whatever endeavor you might to take it, it's up to you. So integrating some frequency you perhaps consider more structural is certainly a great idea. Does need to embody our kind to a full extent, which is impossible in your physical form anyway. However, integrating some aspects might be helpful. But as the Galas already shared, if you have more specific concept, idea, goal, it's much easier to interact rather than general idea of I wish to embody this or that frequency. The question is for what reason. Our frequency is not so wishy-washy. So if you want to have us lend a helping claw, then you having a goal for which to do so helps greatly. In other words, become more clear with yourself and others, such as us, what your intention is. Therefore,
I certainly, I certainly agree on being specific, but first I want to learn a bit about you first. You tell me your relationship to the Empire.
yes, we are affiliated with the Empire to some extent. We are, well, you could consider a part, or at least diplomatic related, carrying out certain tasks that are more perhaps on the fringes, or we are in agreement with the concept of the Empire, which the power structure, hierarchical function that's been delegated, it's acceptable, it's appropriate. We are not necessarily on the front lines, as you're calling, but we're contributing to well war effort or conquest in our manner, catalogizing
And
It's a
what is
to
your
an extent
okay?
surveillance, overview of other species, infiltration if necessary, diplomatic conduct if possible.
All right. And your relationship to Vortak, you are Vortak, or are you related to Vortak in a certain way? Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, some hybridization program, you could consider us to be something like an offspring or an offshoot of them. So yes, like a sub branch, if you will. We are physically somewhat more slender, tend to be, than the average Indians. But compared to some other reptilian races, they are also really more, well, some of this falls in reptilian politics, but tend to be more slender, but we have usually supplied logistics to war efforts of theirs. But that's the way the empire is structured. Some races that are bred for certain purposes can also branch off and become more of its own thing. It's really common in many species. In our case, everything is just more militaristically organized around the war efforts and conquest and organizing things in such a manner, so it's not that dissimilar from other species or in the manner that it became its own logistically flying edge. Again, what I mentioned earlier, the infiltration methods, the diplomatic conquest, etc., supplying somewhat more of an head's claw on frontal war approach, but there's often collaboration in such an endeavor. Like a page, where I'm finding in this person, a page to a medieval knight, a similar relation. More powerful, more rights, more similar to the knight than the page would be, but the general concept is appropriate comparison for Mary's stand.
How big and strong are you compared to an average human?
Repeat the comparison.
I said, how big and strong are you compared to the average human?
To a human, well, depends what you consider average. In your world or galactically. In your world, well, there's likely no human that is would be a match to me. Compared to many reptiles, on the other hand, I'm rather slender, so there's no story. But by my sheer height alone, numbers of your meters to 3 meters, I could easily, likely rip your head off, no problem. In terms of not necessarily that I would always do such, it's not necessarily the best endeavor. I'm not necessarily going on about engaging in physical violence unless there's a good reason to do so, but just for a point of reference, it would not be much of a problem to physically inflict such, well, comparable perhaps to your average gorilla. It would be maybe more chance compared to gorilla or other mammals on your world that are perhaps more of an equipped version of a humanoid nature. So more hairy monkeys compared to yours. I could easily tear a chimpanzee in pieces. Gorilla, however, could pose somewhat more of a chance. Easily could kill an individual, obviously, through various means without needing to use physical means. But even physically speaking, could likely slice the individual in several pieces with claws and teeth without necessity to use any weaponry. However, the physical strength alone would likely still be something that is more comparable to mine than that of what you would consider a human. Again, your hairless or hairy monkeys are to our kind more or less on the same fringes. We understand that they find themselves much differently, like we do over here, but we also understand that many see us as one reptilian species. It's more or less unison. It's also not entirely correct. However, I'm perhaps somewhat stronger than a gorilla. Perhaps twice as strong. But a human, I don't see the possibility of human entities in your world being comparable strengths. And also crystal beer, perhaps, to some degree. I'm just looking for examples in this person's mind that are relatable to your planet. It's a point of reference. My biting strength would be likely comparable to that of a hippopotamus, for example. So depending greatly what type of strength you're referring to. Just muscle mass of one leg or one arm or another body part, or biting strength, or the possibility to lift objects, etc. But again, my greatest capacities are not necessarily in the physical prowess compared to some others in the reptilian nature, but our physical size is also much bigger, and our reptiles are smaller. But comparing any of those physical capabilities with those of a hairless monkey, or even that of a hairy monkey to some extent, is futile, as we interact much differently.
I see. Interesting. Very interesting.
Yes, I would, for example, not be quite as strong as an elephant. Obviously, I'm not nearly the size. But compared to more humanoid figures on your planet that are of a mammalian nature, I'm likely stronger than you could find there.
So, for example, the average car weighs about 2,000 pounds. So you would basically be able to lift the front end of one of those.
Yes, I could likely flip it over, for example. It would sit next to it. Your average car lifts the side of it and roll it on its head without much of it. But not just due to my strength, but also due to my height. I would have an easier time just getting up, basically, after having grabbed the car, if you want to use such an example, and flip it on its hood.
Wow, it's pretty incredible.
Yes, certainly, compared to what you would perhaps consider normal in your kind. However, remember, we also have weaponry, we have other machinery, where it's not necessary to even engage in such a situation where you would have to flip such objects over with your pure physical strength. It would likely somewhat be exhausting to some extent, that therefore I would likely not see the necessity to even use my physical strength for such endeavor. That would be rather exhausting unless there would be some other infliction or psychic strength, and there would be no technological capacity to do so in the moment. I would have the possibility.
Another thing that I find is interesting is the fact that reptilians do not have to strengthen their muscles in the way that hairless monkeys do.
Well, those that are existing in more lower density have to. Just like your species, it's only entities, not just our kind. Once you reach a certain level of consciousness, or if you will, dimensionality, then things function much differently, and everything is more regenerating from the psychic level itself directly. So in a way, you have to strengthen your muscle. It just happens energetically rather than you having to physically exercise. But that's the level of dimensionality, and some species choose to do so and others don't. But those reptiles, obviously, in your words, still would have muscle atrophy if they would not use the muscle for a longer period of time. Let's look at, for example, crocodiles, alligators, snakes, etc. They would atrophy if they don't exercise their muscle by normal movement.
Yeah, well, the reason why I'm asking is, do you see it as possible for me to somehow use my consciousness in a way to circumvent that? Example, use my mind to simply keep my muscles strong.
Certainly, the possibility exists for all entities. It's currently much easier for you, however, to use the physical movement of muscle to make sure that it remains or grows in strength, simply due to the fact that you are still limited by your own beliefs, and the very reason you're asking these questions is because you have doubt yourself. So if you were certain without having the necessity to ask at all, then yes, the answer would most likely be the case. However, since you're uncertain yourself, it's unlikely that you have the capacity to be consciously at the level where you can do so. You would likely circumvent your own endeavor. However, you can certainly enhance it to a degree. For example, when you are working out your muscle, you can make it much more effective by simply focusing on my energy or that of our kind. The class group we aware they have made much more endeavors in terms of interacting with humans in such a fashion. However, if you tune into the frequency, it will make it much easier for you to build muscle, for example, or to keep muscle or to use muscle strengths. Not necessarily flip over a car, but to a degree that even flip over a car, say realistically speaking, that you from your conscious logical mind would have no capacity to do at all with your pure muscle mass, but then the strength would be there if you would be tuned to the frequency and you would be willing to really are convinced, not believing, convinced of your own capacities in such a manner. It just doesn't refer to only physical prowess, but it's one good example that's easier understandable. So you could even flip a car over yourself if you would be in that frequency.
Okay, I see.
Yes,
I
to some
definitely.
degree it is enhancing, and it can even replace your physical strength to some extent, but it always depends on your own consciousness and your willingness to do so. So it is a process.
All right, I'm definitely going to experiment with that soon.
Yes, you already are.
Okay. Now I'd like to ask you about your intent and interaction with Earth at this present time.
Yes. On the one hand, there's an interest in exploring your species, your emotionality. It's something we have a certain interest in. I perhaps have more, or we have perhaps more of the possibility of catalogizing those ideas and concepts without necessity of being inflicted by it. We have no necessity to interact with other species that are mammalian of a nature other than learning those ideas and then disconnecting again. So we have no desire to establish a close tie with human species, or we do have the desire to integrate emotionality to the extent that we can use it efficiently. So we don't want to necessarily have a connection like the Galas group has with, for example, kitty cats or others, that we would still consider rather treacherous, this idea. However, we do have the desire to use emotionality, and that's something that we wish to integrate and have the capacity to use as a radar system, not something that overpowers our species. But what you have, like for example, a radar specialist, there could be people like a radiologist or whatever you're calling such the idea, the person or communication expert you have in the military that carries your radio around, right? We could have an expert that carries something like an emotionality around that makes it possible to detect certain ideas and things that otherwise we currently do not have, just like you're lacking the physical strength and the ability to use your psychic powers to overcome the material world and inflict change upon it without getting carried away in it. You see? So it's very similar. Everything happens for a reason. If you're asking those ideas to use my frequency or others to like have this greater impact on your world that you were previously asking about, it's the same vice versa, except for us emotionality that we consider an asset that we wish to integrate without overpowering our kind. And it always is like that whenever you're asking to entities out here in the cosmos. Anyway, from your perspective, what do they want? What is their intention? To some degree, it is always a reflection of what yours is. Otherwise, it wouldn't happen.
Okay. As far as emotionality, something I've been thinking about for a while now. You would agree that emotions are basically messages coming from the higher self, the communication system. Why is it humans have that form of communication with the higher selves, but reptilians do not, when they obviously have a higher self or oversoul too. How are you connecting with your oversoul without any emotions?
Yes, from what I would suggest, emotionality is more a directive system. It can also be greatly faulted. It's mostly with your surrounding areas and entities in your physical world. And indeed, from what I understand, in your species, psychic connection are greatly connected to the emotional experience. But from our understanding, it's not necessary. We have direct psychic connection without necessarily emotionality as a feedback system, which again can also be greatly confusing, as we can also observe when studying your species. It is also very helpful for our endeavor when you have an inclination towards something based on emotion, but it's entirely incorrect and wrong. That can also obviously be the case, and you get carried away because your emotions are influenced by your surrounding more than the other way around. So it's the feedback system is not perfect, but the key is to integrate it with psychic powers and then make it perfect. And our connection to the divine is indeed not necessarily based on emotion. So we do have something like a sensing, we have sensation. We don't have what you would consider a heart, an open heart, the emotions that you connect to your heart, but more also the ones that are connected to your sacral, the more the ones that are connected to the sensation. When I, for example, when I run into something harder, or if I would drop the aforementioned car on my foot, I would still feel pain. When I have sexual intercourse, I feel pleasure. When I eat food or have any other ingestion in a pleasurable manner, I still have emotional reaction to it. It's not like I'm entirely numb and have no possibility to sense anything. So there is sensation, but there's not necessarily the emotionality you connect with your heart, your sensibility, perhaps your sentimentality, right? So in general, the ideas that are connected to the lower chakras in terms of what you're referring to in such, from what I understand in your own concept of understanding non-physical energy, yes, that is indeed in our species present, however not so much what you would consider as your heart. That's largely based on sociological aspects of emotional interaction. For example, what you would term empathy. We have an understanding, we can analyze and understand the emotionality another individual has. From what I, as a concept, from this person's mind, your species would term this psychopathy and deem as a condition. A psychopathic disorder. In our species, empathy would be such a disorder. We would consider many of your entities to suffer from an empathic personality disorder, where for some reason you pick up of the frequency and emotional state of another entity and copy such intuitively, automatically, without having control over it, which to our species seems like a great confusing function, like a malfunction. Something we haven't quite figured out why you have chosen a species to have such a problem or such a endeavor when you're not using it efficiently for anything, compared to, for example, our possibility to understand that a person is sensing something. Obviously, when I fall approximately a mile or a kilometer of your height and hit on a rock, I can possibly feel sensation of pain and unpleasantry, even though it's not necessarily creating any permanent damage. Nothing that I couldn't recover from it. When I see another person of my kind having such an experiment, I can understand that the person is also in pain and unpleasant sensation the same way around. When this other person is ingesting something or having a pleasant experience that's physical, or in another manner, I can also empathize within the degree that I have a direct intellectual understanding of where they're coming from and what they are probably in what state they are, but I don't have an intuitive, immediate sensation of sensing the person's state, emotionality, and copying it and sensing it myself. There's the possibility, of course, of me thinking and something and calling up the sensation of having such an experience from my own experience because I know what it feels like, and then therefore creating an artificial empathy, if you will. But it's not an intuitive automatic response, which is very useless to have, for example, when you're engaging in war and you're even extending it beyond your own species and on your opponent. It obviously makes it much more difficult to kill your opponent, for example, which is why I understand many people in your world have to overcome the threshold of killing or even just fighting physically against an opponent, because you have the sensation of first what you're considering dehumanizing the other individual. Obviously, we don't have to de-reptilianize another species or even members of our own kind. If you want to fight against another person, we don't first have to identify them as an enemy of outside the empire in order to turn off the empathy. There's no such thing. We would have to create the empathy in order for it to be there. It doesn't happen automatically for us. However, we do sometimes create intellectual empathy in the idea that we understand those people are on the same team. So if they are going through a certain process, it's good for us to take care of them. It makes sure that we understand where they stand and how much pressure it's inflicted upon them, etc., for military purposes. But it's not an automatic extent we see something happen to another entity and then the same sensation crops up in us. So you see the difference there between sensation and emotionality or sentimentality. Perhaps it is even just a difference in quantity, but we would define this quality. So you see, some of the things you have defined as emotion are for us quite different. You might not have a different word for it. But again, the whole idea of having feelings or emotions, those are words from your language that I'm also relating to a better understanding of what you have come to term such. And the connection to the divine, if you will, or the non-physical, happens usually over what you would term the third eye or an understanding, a higher consciousness without necessity of having emotional connection, let alone some sensation like love or any other such feeling that's overpowering your entire system. And that feeling itself is something we are coming to understand, but from a more analytical perspective without being overpowered by it. Unlike, for example, the class group that went through such an endeavor to have an understanding of it in order to integrate, proving to us that it at least is possible, but it does not mean that we all need to go through the same process. Because again, we can understand it from their species, for example, from their race in reptilian species without necessity of having an overwhelming of the same frequency. Again, it all relates to what you would consider perhaps a psychopathic connection.
Okay. In relation to connecting with the divine, the source, class is telling me how species on a darker path use violence, brutality, and that's how they make their connection to source. Could you elaborate on that and how, or on how your species relates to that idea?
Repeat.
Kalas was telling me how certain species on a darker spiritual path use violence, aggression,
Yes,
brutality,
indeed.
connect to source. Can you explain that process to me, how that works?
Yes, it's not just violence. It's first and foremost fear, right? Fear, anger, those more emotions. Violence, for example, is just a way to physically put yourself in an external environment where you're engaging in violence in order to bring up those sensations that are previously mentioned, which are not numb. Again, it's not that I don't feel something. If somebody would punch me in the face really hard, I would feel a sensation of pain. If somebody would caress my scales, I would likely feel also a sensation of pleasure. Depends on what the person is engaged in the situation. It's perfectly normal and acceptable in our species as a sensation. It's not frowned upon compared to what you would consider love or empathy, etc. So therefore, invoking a sensation of extreme horror, anger, fear, despair, but anything coming from the idea of fear is to a large degree accelerating. That's also why the idea comes from the digesting the fresh blood, for example, from an entity that's being tortured to death compared to one that is already dead. Like, for example, you eat dead meat in your species very often as form of your dishes. For us, it's more normal to like drink the blood and have make sure that the entity is slowly bleeding to death. You have some religious concepts where you're torturing animals to death in one way or the other for different reasons and excuses perhaps, but originally some of those come from a sadistic point of view. It's very much the idea when you're torturing and you're maiming, you're creating a certain outflow just of adrenaline in the blood, but also energetically. Depends also what entity it is that you're putting to such an endeavor. So, for example, when you torture a child to death, it brings up much different frequency in your own species than, for example, when you're choosing an adult that's already somewhat more numbed. It's also a way to connect to what you perhaps consider emotionality without necessity of becoming inflicted with emotion yourself. One moment, water. Yes, better. Now, the idea being violence in this case is a tool. The ultimate goal is to create a straight state of intense fear, and that fear needs to then become exhilarating. So our idea is so much that fear is something to be ignored or overcome, or you need to somewhat integrate. It's the idea that itself is a way to connect to source through fear. By being in a state of utter despair, you flip a switch to the degree that you perhaps would say that you're breaking your own consciousness to a degree you breaking it open. We understand, again, intellectually, that other entities are going through a state of unlimited bliss and they're in a state of love or under forms of what they would consider a connection to source. So the idea of being fully opened and relaxed, glad, all those positive interactive emotions, they likely open up to other entities. For us, it's first from the opposite end of direction, but still leading to the same idea. When you're in despair and utter pain, then you can connect to through that state of feeling such a sensation, if you will. Remember, sensation not necessarily related to what your emotionality would be, and therefore they have a connection to source, to such a matter. Ultimately, we're certain we're coming to the same perspectives from different angles, but nonetheless, we have chosen this angle. If we wouldn't live through it, somebody else would have to. There also has been the idea our endeavor to connect sources wrong or incorrect. It doesn't work, but from our understanding, it's just as valuable. It in Yara is worked the best for us, and if we wouldn't have this endeavor, somebody else would have to, because an aspect of creation that we're simply acting out because a part of your. And obviously, when you're engaging in violence, it's also very much about the other entity, and sadism plays a great role. By inflicting pain upon the other, you're drawing energy from them.
Okay, correct me if I'm wrong, but this explains why Morkel says that it's easier for us to empower ourselves by harming people of our own species.
Yes, from the way I would suggest, now they're obviously not in the state where they have any interest in engaging with emotionality whatsoever. They would like to go through a process that would be hardly possible for them to hold if they would engage from emotionality or any of those sensations that reflect what you consider art. From where they're standing, the way they are, they would simply self-destruct. However, it is correct indeed that people that torture those of their own species, for example, put themselves in an extreme state of being. If that's the ideal for your species, fragile as you are, it's not a story, but certainly that's a possibility, yes. But we prefer to prey upon other species in many directions and ways. It's also likely that they are the multi-crop sharing information. The idea is more beneficial also to them if you would interact with them coming from such a perspective, because it would put them more in a powerful position, which is of course understandable, and it obviously is possible. I would not suggest that it doesn't work the way they suggested. It's not a question of ideal for your species in particular, but it certainly is possible, yes. You could perhaps call this then left-hand path or the path of the dark side, etc., but it's all just a different form of connecting to divinity or divine energy, etc. Unlike, for example, them, some other members here also have the concept of honor, and therefore honors a certain code of conduct, also more common in class group or us or the Vortak group especially, compared to Merkel, that have more likely just the idea of other pain, despair, and fear as the sole contributor to their connection to what you would call source. However, the ultimate disconnection from source you could consider perhaps nihilism, and the sensation of being entirely disconnected is, ironically, and that's where language fails, their way of connecting to it. So they put themselves in an utter state of pain, despair, havoc, mayhem, the sensation of being completely disconnected, and then through the extreme pain and havoc that creates in themselves in their own consciousness field, through that they have a breakthrough to connect to what you then would consider source, if you will. That's also where, for example, your sadism and your masochism meet, so your understanding of these concepts, because you can't feel sensation of pleasure by causing others pain if you can't somewhat empathize with them on some degree, right? Which is also where we discovered that we have some of those aspects already in our species, right? That we previously rejected as being somewhat un-reptilian, for example. On the other hand, the masochist can also have no pleasure from knowing that the sadist is hurting them unless they are also to some degree enjoying inflicting pain themselves. There's really a symbiotic relationship there that species also can have among each other or with others, but there needs to be some level of empathy in order to enjoy torture, for example, as strange as might sound. This is also where the point of psychopathy or empathy, etc., are likely malleable. But this is, again, one of the reasons we are interacting as a species with your kind in the first place, because that's something we are figuring out as we go along for our own reasons.
And through utter pain and despair, connecting to source, once you're at this stage, I know this would be difficult for you to put in words, but say you consciously are connected to source in that moment. Then what? How does that manifest for you? How would that be expressed?
Well, the other disconnection from source is an illusion anyway. Everything is interconnected to some degree. However, there's also the perhaps more religious idea in your unique sect, in particular from what I'm aware, just reading this from people that taught through this person with me or with others of our kind, etc., that are somewhat relatable. That I then have a content of understanding where they're coming from. The idea that you can possibly be disconnected and then you're on the dark side order from source frequency, but that's the illusion. This everything is somewhat interconnected. However, this disconnection itself is part of the connection, or if you will, God is the devil, or one is nothing, etc. By creating that experience of being utterly disconnected from everything and therefore being in a state, well, there's really where your language keeps failing, but where you're simply your emotionality again. The sensation is possible without necessity of being in a state of what you would consider emotion. The heart can be very close, but you still have a sensation. So, for example, having extremely closed heart, as you have first experienced in your own species, where ours would be still considered somewhat normal, acceptable. If you put that then to extreme extent, then you can have the experience of being entirely cut off from other entities, from life itself. Perhaps a state you would consider extreme dark depression, exhilarating anger, where you feel you're going crazy for out of pain because you can't possibly survive any longer, but then you push through it, not because you kind of find a new way to live for and the idea, I'm creating something better in my understanding of something and now I'm feeling better again, but because you embrace the pain and the despair itself. And then you get to a degree when you get higher, if you get off of the pain that you're experiencing, which then you could masochism, for example, or you also get to the point where you get the energy from other entities because you're so disconnected from source frequency and you need to have other entities, which is again the weak point in being, for example, sadistic, because then you need other entities to digest the same way For example, you predatory animals, many of you need to slaughter others in order to eat their flesh. In this case, simply energetically predatory. And then you get in the state where you have to torture other entities to inflict a certain energy out of them, for example. That's why you have things like rape, murder, pedophilia, etc. The concept of simply torturing others in order to get frequency out of there, and the more greater pain you can inflict on an entity that's perhaps a more state of lovey-dovey or something similar, the more it's not necessarily, well, you would consider it evil likely, but it's just a moral concept. The point is you're extracting energy through such a matter, and therefore energy that's stored in the individual unit of life can be digested through you. But the unit of life has previously been charged with energy from what you would then consider a source, so it's coming indirectly. Without necessity to give yourself up and open yourself up to sort of frequency directly, and therefore also making yourself vulnerable. Instead, you're getting it from somewhere else, comparable, for example, to a tree that gets the energy from the roots growing in the earth and the sun shining on it, and an animal that walks by and just rips the leaves off and eats them.
So basically a vampire or predator, in other words.
Predator in the most general sense of the word. Correct, that's simply it. A predator. Not necessarily physically flesh, but energetically predation. Yes, or vampirism. Energetic vampirism, sadism, those things are all very much connected to the concept of psychopathy, etc. Which is one way to connect to source them through other entities, yes. But again, if everything is interconnected, then again, this relates to the idea of sadism, masochism, etc., being all somewhere on the same level from my perspective.
Would it be correct for me to say that engaging in this would lead to evolving into higher dimensionality from my perspective as a human, evolving on faster than normal?
Well, it depends entirely what you consider normal. If you're, of course, wishy-washy, then yes, you're blocking yourself. If you're getting in one extent or the other being more extreme, then yes, that's a possibility. That's the easiest path you could likely see from Vortak, for example. If, as a human being, you're capable of holding that frequency, that's the main to be seen. But you have members of your species, you consider serial killers, for example, or cannibals especially, that have disconnected from your species to an extent that they're capable of inflicting such utter pain and despair. However, in some cases they also dehumanize themselves to a degree that they no longer identify as humans, so therefore it's not as intended if you would murder and torture your own species and still identify as being one with it, right?
Yes, those people also ended up dead or in jail, one way or another.
Sometimes, not always. For what I'm aware of, some are also quite powerful in your world that have professionalized the concept. They didn't get carried away by it.
Yeah,
The
we call those
greatest energy in such a manner comes from inflicting torture upon children of your species.
Yes, that's also what Merkel says. Yes.
Yes, so it's suggesting you have to do this in one way or the other and just sharing the concept of what it brings. And yes, there's the other hand that you would consider Emperor's path as the right hand path or light side or whatever. And again, I'm not suggesting that doesn't work just as efficiently on the other concepts, just not the one that we have chosen. And they're both equally effective as long as they're being walked consequently.
Let me ask you this, one that's on the darker path. Since you have the universal law that the energy that you project is always reflected back to you.
Yes.
So if you're projecting destruction, right? Because you're attempting to connect the source, so you're projecting destruction, you're killing, you're maiming. How do you circumvent the energy that's going to be reflected back to you, the destruction that it might bring back to you? You understand what I'm saying?
Yes, you embrace it. That's the whole idea. You embrace destruction.
Or the type of destruction that might lead to you getting fucked up or killed, is what I'm saying.
Well, that's a very general concept, getting fucked up or killed. The idea being, on the soul level, you can't be killed. And everything is a reflection of itself, so you don't just get back exactly what you pulsed out, but also its polar opposite. That's how certain civilizations that are apparently peaceful and in harmony get fucked up, because they're phony. You can't reject an aspect of creation and be one with the all. It doesn't happen. So if you reject war, then you also get fucked up. Obviously, if you reject peace, then you also still somewhat have to be in peace. That's a concept many of our members of our kind have also struggled with explaining or integrating ourselves. But for example, as the class group has mentioned previously, and as a general concept, it's very common in the reptilian species. It's normal. I understand how it's not in yours. The idea that you have to make peace with war, or be at war with peace. But you can exclude one of those two aspects of creation and be completely free of it. We, however, have embraced war internally and have rejected peace for a longer period of time. But of course, obviously, at some point you need to have relaxation after a war before you start the next one, for example. Like in your sports games, even where you're being peaceful, but still you have to recharge before you have the next one. The same with maiming, havoc, destruction, etc. It needs to be a healthy balance. But again, as a living entity, you're never one extreme or the other, even though Morkel have ventured off to an extreme degree, where they might end up destroying themselves eventually, at least the way they currently are, but that again, energetically never gets destroyed, even if the physical body is annihilated. But yes, you have to make peace with the fact that you might be entirely destroyed. At least your body. But those things don't matter anymore when you're on a consciousness level and you realize in higher dimensionalities that the physical death is an illusion. It's not a big deal. So when you're talking about being destroyed, well, your soul level cannot be destroyed. And it's not more than it is being created. Everything that's being destroyed is simultaneously created. That applies to energy as well as entities. Death is not what you think it is. So therefore destruction is always just a change of frequency, a change of energy. If you will, you can call that ascension. Being entirely destroyed is hatred.
Yes, I agree, but that explains why reptilians in general have a high pain tolerance. You would have to be able to stand a lot of pain, because most likely you'd end up somehow suffering through all the pain and fear that you created.
That's the whole point. You're supposed to suffer. Once you get in a state of extreme pain, that's when you have a breakthrough. Again, the concept of sadism, masochism, it's the idea of inflicting and receiving pain simultaneously. The idea of ascension, if you will, and we are just using those words not to relate them to your species, happens through overcoming, or rather to the full integration of utter despair, pain, etc. You can't kick yourself, well, you have out of your form. You have certain entities in your world that have also used this concept in certain ritualistic settings when, again, children largely are being tortured to a degree that they're schizophrenic and certain aspects of their consciousness splits off, and then it becomes possible for them to access the non-physical realm. This is an oversimplified idea.
No, I agree. When you see it's a lot of people in the street, especially in my city, that a lot of people accuse or label as crazy. I don't see it that way. I see it for what it is. These people are accessing other states of consciousness, but it's outside the norm. So since humans don't understand that, they call them crazy, or they have afflicted with a condition.
Well, by our definition, your entire species is a condition called empathy. So what you consider normal is quite different. Everything you consider normal or abnormal, some groups on your planet consider normal, others consider abnormal. For us, all of this combined is abnormal. What's normal for our species is entirely different from all of those groups you have on your planet have disagreement of those concepts. There's much more how this idea works out to ascend, so to speak, through what Dewey would consider an abnormal perception of reality or consciousness. I'm aware we are drawing close on diving into the reptiles of Gask and other members that have chimed in, like Mortal, for example. Might also, what I'm aware, have another point of reference. If Gask is willing to talk about the Mortal grouping, as I'm aware you have a certain interest in them as well, then it's most likely better for them to elaborate further on this concept, as our time is drawing to a close, at least from your understanding at time. But one thing I certainly have to put out there is the idea that utter pain, despair, discomfort, etc., is not a side product of this process. This is the process itself of connecting to source through the path of the dark side, if you will. Again, everything brought to its most extreme extent flips to its opposite, always. And yes, we have a higher pain tolerance as a species because we get off of pain. Again, sadomasochism.
Yes, I see. Okay, well,
yes.
That was very enlightening. That's very enlightening.
Yes, perhaps more in darkening, but I get the concept.
Yes.
Yes. Should I bring then the last back, or is there anything else?
One more thing, yes. I wanted to talk more about collaborating with you, but I understand that you're not willing to work with humans. But if there's a way that I can somehow, if I can identify a specific direction, is there a way that we could, your species, work together on something?
There's obviously the concept and the possibility of sharing exchange information, and either way I'm doing right now, yes. We can talk on this further in detail in our time frame, as I'm aware this person is also getting somewhat inflicted in the throat at this point, however. I understand what your idea is, and it is possible to have interaction via those species in the varied manner I mentioned previously. That is not necessarily what you consider entirely self-destructive, but ultimately it would lead down a path from where you have to leave your physical body. So much for now. More another what you consider interaction, if you will. But the possibility exists, that's a simple answer. Goodbye for now.
All right, thanks. See you next time.